Thank you very much for coming. This is a very, very nice turnout, and we know that we're fighting against a very beautiful day, one of the last beautiful days that we're going to see here in Ohio, so we're really doubly appreciated that you could make it in here. One of the things we'd like to do is today's seminar is part of a continuing series of talks that are presented by Sigma Xi, and this time is in conjunction with the Department of Biology, Department of Anthropology, and also the Evolutionary Biology Group. So what we'd like to do is, before I begin by introducing the speaker, I'd like to give a couple announcements first. The first announcement that we have is if there are any Sigma Xi members in the audience, please come on down and sign the sheet because we want to find out who you are and if everybody's attending. The other thing we'd like to do is make a couple of announcements about some upcoming events that are occurring. Next Wednesday, on November 18th, there'll be a free lecture, so you can't beat the price, on human evolution. And what we're going to do is the research team that studied Ardipithecus rhombus, which includes Bruce Latimer, myself, Johannes Haile Selassie, and Linda Spurlock, will be giving a talk over at the Natural History Museum. The talk will be held at 7 p.m. next Wednesday, November 18th. It's free, so come one and come all. And what we're going to do is we're going to finally reveal all the secrets of Ardipithecus rhombus that have been hidden in the ground and hidden in our heads for the past 17 years. The other thing we'd like to do is we'd also like to announce that on November 24th, which is the anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, there'll be a gathering here, a birthday of sorts, a celebration of the publication, in Clap Room 108. So again, that's November 24th, celebrating Darwin's publication of On the Origins of Species at Clap 108. So yes, come on down.
It's another sign-up, so the department has a sign-up sheet which is that everybody's here can sign in what department you are because we're trying to track attendance at biology after 7. Thank you.
Now what I'd like to do is, it's my great, great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Frayer. He is a professor at the University of Kansas, and he's going to talk to, he will be giving two talks today. One he gave at lunch, and another one he will give now. And both of these talks are on topics that are both confusing and intriguing to me. Today's lunch topic was on the Homo floresiensis, that little tiny microcephalic midget from the island of Flores. And it was a very entertaining, informative talk from someone who has no axes to grind, but gave a very insightful talk about the biology and the scientific history, context of the study of these fossils. But right now, he's going to talk about something that formed the core of his research career, and that'll be on the history and paleobiology of Neanderthals and their research. Now, Dr. Frayer, as I said, is the full professor at the University of Kansas, but he began early in the stages of academic career. He started here in Ohio, and he received his master's degree from Case Western Reserve University, so we can claim him as one of our own. And it's just really a pleasure to welcome you back and to introduce your talk today. Thank you very much.
It's working okay? Can we have the lights down a little bit? Is that possible? Oh. Is it going to interfere with your recording, the lights down? Okay. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be back here at Bruce Latimer saying, well, what's it feel like to be back at Case? I was here in 1970 and 71, and Case has changed a lot since then. It was only 2 or 3 years after Case and Western Reserve became the same place, the same university, so it all is irrelevant to most of you, but it was a fun time. I enjoyed my days at Case. I went on because my advisor got a job at the University of Michigan, and I went with him, or he took me with him. And a bunch of other people left, so there wasn't any reason to stay. But I grew up in Ohio. I'm from a little town called Mount Gilead, Ohio, which is just north of Columbus. And so I'm really from Ohio, but I've lived in Kansas for 34 years, so I'm from Kansas, really. Anyway, what I wanted to talk today about is, as you can see, who says Neanderthals are so different? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about morphology. I'll do a little bit. But I want to really focus more on what people think of Neanderthals, and then how they're different than the common perception. And then finish up with some of my own work on the Neanderthals from Croatia, from Krapina and Vindija, two, one early and one late Neanderthal site. The first Neanderthal was found, and by the way, it's Neanderthal. The H is silent and has been silent since 1903. My advisor, whose name is Milford Walpoff, spells it Neanderthal and pronounces it Neanderthal. It's one of the most disjunctive way of thinking about it. But anyway, this is the arrow points to the cave where it was found by workmen. The skeleton was found by workmen. And just for right now, just notice the reconstruction of that valley, because there'll be a slide in a few minutes that shows you something very different. The cave is actually, the specimen is actually called Feldhofer, and it's referred to as Feldhofer 1 because there's some evidence there may be another individual. But the main specimen was found in 1856, 3 years before the publication of The Origin of Species. And it's been debated ever since. This is what the bones look like. It almost for sure was a burial just because of the completeness of the bones. And considering that this was not collected by scientists but collected by workmen and then gathered together by a school teacher who recognized the bones were something other than being modern, it's amazing that we have as much as we do. But you can see we have a skull cap. Those other little bones I'll talk about in a minute. There's the right and the left arm. The left arm, you can see the elbow it sustained a fracture, and we have the pelvis and both femora. So it's plus a few ribs. So it's reasonably complete. And it's amazing considering the time that it was discovered, and it wasn't discovered by scientific excavations. When it was found, it was here are some of the initial discussions of it. Were this the skeleton of the oldest man, then the oldest man was a freak. And that was actually the word. It's not a translation from German. It was some British guy said that. Other people thought it was a poor idiot or a hermit, and maybe the reason it had brow ridges is because it had a wounded arm and it winced a lot, and when it did, it caused the brow ridges to grow. But this is 150 years ago, so we laugh. But there are still idiotic things are being said today that they'll be laughing about in 150 years from now. The first formal description of the Feldhofer cave specimen was done on a cast by a British anatomist, and this is the last sentence of his description. And in the past, people always tried to make some sort of moral judgments about fossils, and it's not done so much anymore. But I like this. The skull conformed to the brain case of a chimpanzee, and the simial faculties are unimprovable, not unprovable, but unimprovable, and incapable of moral or theistic conception. A similar darkness characterized the being to which the fossil belonged. So Neanderthals were not immediately recognized as one of us. They were recognized as something different, all right, from the first formal taxonomic descriptions. And in fact, they were called Homo neanderthalensis, given a separate species name. And there you can see the darkness, the dark soul of the Neanderthal as it's reconstructed now. It's very hard to find a Neanderthal smiling, by the way, even with all the modern biological understanding of Neanderthals. Here's the amazing thing. In 2002, German scientists went back to that valley and discovered the material was dumped out of the cave. They discovered where the dumping areas were, and when they did that, they noticed that there was, they found some pieces, and this piece of zygomatic fits perfectly onto the original specimen, found 153 years apart, or 150 years apart. Amazing. And they also found a piece of the skull at the back and a piece of one of the humeri. So they found 3 pieces that fit on to the specimen. Amazing. 150 years apart. But the cave didn't exist anymore. And in fact, the valley, as you saw, didn't exist anymore. It was completely mined away for the limestone to build steel for the German culture. The cave doesn't exist anymore. The cave is in air someplace. And it's just amazing that they were able to go back. And this is what the site looks like today. The valley, which was really narrow, is now widened out. It looks like a river plain. And the Neanderthal specimen was found off to the right somewhere. Things like that happen in paleoanthropology all the time. The original, there were more Neanderthals found after that. And in France, there was this famous specimen that was found called La Chapelle, described by this Frenchman by the name of Marcel and Beall. And Beall, in his monograph of 1913, suggested that Neanderthals had nothing to do with us. He said, no modern human type can be considered a direct descendant, even with modifications of the European Neanderthal type. So Neanderthals are something different, apart from us. And that's not Beall's reconstruction, but who would want to have an ancestor like that? But that's a more recent reconstruction. And when Beall made his comparisons, he considered Neanderthals in the middle, the La Chapelle skull, halfway in between chimpanzees on the bottom, even though they had a brain size bigger than the modern sapiens on the top. And in the long run, he had Neanderthals more like the chimp than like the human. And subsequent reconstructions made Neanderthals even more ape-like. Here they have a divergent toe, not that much different than Ardipithecus. A little bit, but way divergent. And stooped over, and to make them even more menacing, they made them black, because that's scarier. It turns out the Neanderthals we know were very light-skinned and probably had red hair based on genetics. But that's another talk. Or they made them look stupid. You know, like, and sort of with hanging their head on their chest, etc. And if you look at the modern popular literature, I don't have time to go through all these, but there's a ton of literature on this. Your mother was a Neanderthal. Here's the Neanderthal man ravaging a white woman, as you can see. You know, I've always tell my students at Kansas, this is the most unkindest cut of all, as Neanderthal as a Californian. I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, Do Not Waste Your... Did anybody seen this movie? It's a terrible movie, right? I've had students say, oh, no, I like it. It's awful. And then even into the workplace, you have Neanderthals at work. So Neanderthals are what I refer to as the paleontological N-word. If you want to insult someone, call them a Neanderthal, okay? And I gave a talk a few weeks ago down in Texas, and I typed in on the computer Texans as Neanderthals, and you can't imagine the number of quotes that I had come up. And I typed in Ohioans as Neanderthals and Clevelanders as Neanderthals, and I got some too. And then I thought, God, I wonder if you can type in Hawaiians as Neanderthals. And sure enough, if you type Hawaiians as Neanderthals into Google search, you'll get people calling people from the Hawaiian Islands Neanderthals. But I got some really good ones from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and I'll just quickly go through them just to show you how if you want to disparage somebody, you call them a Neanderthal. I'm not your average brain-dead Neanderthal Browns fan. They have no class. This is how you insult somebody from Buffalo. Good riddance, you disease. Ohio is a pit of Neanderthal legislation. All your comments here about county female employees suggest one thing. You are one goon, Neanderthal goon. Cleveland is in trouble with these demonic Neanderthal troglodytes posting on the net. That's getting everybody, troglodytes and a Neanderthal. And here's my favorite one. I'm not sure what this means, but this is so great. She turned into a semi-giant Neanderthal rabbit with a bad attitude. So if you want to insult somebody, call them a Neanderthal, whether it's a human or a rabbit. And just to show you that I'm not picking on Clevelanders, here's what somebody said about Kansas. People, any chance we could sell off this useless state with its useless people and pay off debts. Don't need Kansas, don't want it. Ignorant Neanderthals. They are, I love this last one. They are a state and a people that add nothing to mankind. So Neanderthals have an image problem. Is it deserved? So what I want to spend the rest of the, I don't think I needed to tell you that. If I said you're a Neanderthal, maybe after this talk you won't take such a great offense. If I say it to her, I know her, and she wouldn't mind it at all. But I think you all knew that. Just a real quick paleontological survey. Neanderthals are found only in Europe and the Near East. They're not found in North Africa, and they stretch, at least the Mousterian culture stretches over as far as Nepal. But for the most part, they're European and Near Eastern, Levant, all right? But not down into Africa and not into to East Africa or to North Africa. They lived through both glacial and interglacial periods. So they lived through really cold times in Europe. Sometimes they moved out, and they lived through really warm times in Europe. So they were adaptable. They have a distinctive morphology in that if you look at a skull, you can kind of tell if it's a Neanderthal or not because of some morphological features. But these unique features are shared with later modern populations. And like I said, I'm not going to talk about morphology, but let me just show you one, my favorite one. It's something called the HO mandibular foramen. And this is where, when the dentist gives you a shot to numb the teeth in the mandible, they go in and go into that area. And what they're aiming for is that mandibular nerve that comes down and services the teeth in the jaw. So you're looking at I can't see over here, but you can't see it anyway because it's a black cursor on a black screen. But where the top arrow is, that's a hole, and the mandibular nerve comes down and services. If you look at from the back, it's a different mandible, but you can see why it's called HO. HO stands for horizontal oval. This is contrasted with the modern condition where that area is open. There's no bar or bone runs across, but it's like a V-shaped fissure. And so the two on the left are Neanderthals, and the one on the right is modern, but in fact they're all three Neanderthals because there's a bunch of variation that we see in Neanderthals. And here's the HO mandibular foramen, the frequency of it. Homo heidelbergensis is the precursors of Neanderthals dated around 500,000 years, and there are a bunch of mandibles, primarily from a site in Spain, but there are other mandibles too. Then we have the frequency of European Neanderthals of about 53%, and these are all European Neanderthals down here, and the first white arrow shows the HO, and the other one shows the modern. All right, so it's a real...
Is there a laser pointer on there?
No, there is. It's mine, but I never figured out how to work it. But you can see the arrows, all right? And in European Neanderthals just from Europe, from all around, from France and Germany, et cetera, it's about 53%. And then if you go to the period that follows the Neanderthals, the moderns, it's 13%, 14%, which is about the same as the likely ancestor, Heidelbergensis. And then you drop down to 7%, down into the Mesolithic, the last hunters and gatherers of Europe, to 3%. Medieval Hungarians, if they're moderns, who knows for sure. The Todd collection, I just had a student that was working on the Todd collection last spring, and she surveyed 400 mandibles or something and found out it was about 1% or a little more. And then finally, the Africanese that supposedly came in and replaced the Neanderthals and gave rise to the early Upper Paleolithic, you can see it's 0. Now there's only 2 in that, but still 0. And the point that I want to show on this is that there's a persistence of some of these Neanderthal traits in subsequent populations, just to suggest there's a measure of continuity. Nobody argues anymore that Neanderthals are the direct ancestors. If anything, people argue there's some population mixing with more modern groups that are coming in from the south, and eventually Neanderthals just got bred out of existence, whatever. But what I want to focus on today are are cultural similarities, and then end up, like as I said, end up with some research that I've done on the Neanderthals of Croatia with on the bones, but it relates to cultural similarities. Neanderthals have always been considered to be incompetent, bumblers, aimlessly wandering the landscape. Somebody suggested one time recently, and the guy's still publishing, suggested that Neanderthals had big, thick bones and large large joints, etc., because they were aimlessly wandering the landscape. So they would leave the cave, in the morning like this. And if I don't come back, I'm a Neanderthal because I'm aimlessly wandering around the hall. And then the reason the joints were so big is because they were sort of wandering around, and there was no organized hunting, no organized skill associated with subsistence patterns, etc. Well, in the last 10 years, because of modern excavations or going back and looking at old excavations, there have been major changes in the way people think, archaeologists now think about Neanderthals. The first one, it just came out a few years ago, it's a site in Gibraltar where Neanderthals were exploiting marine mammals. They weren't sailing, but they were to go catch them, but they were getting beached, cetaceans, etc., and were collecting mollusks, seals, whales, and also birds. And they were doing this in a I left the slide off, but in a seasonal way, so there's real evidence that they were scheduling their subsistence patterns according to seasonal changes, which is a long way from aimlessly wandering the landscape or the seascape or the beach. Another paper just recently, in the last few years, looked at differences in ungulates, deer, etc., across time. Across the Mousterian is Neanderthal, Chateaubriand is late Neanderthal, and Aurignacian is the earliest moderns. And if you look across those different levels at a site in France, they found no detectable difference between the way the animals were exploited by the earlier populations and by the later populations. So this idea that Neanderthals were somehow deficient, based on this site and others, I think can be rejected. I love the next two slides. There's a site in Spain where Neanderthals show that they could hunt tortoises. And that's the author of Blasco. And she was able to find tortoise bones on Neanderthal sites that had cut marks on them, that some of them were burned, so that they were cooking them. And she even found some that you can't see very well from the picture, but the bottom right-hand corner that seemed like there were human Neanderthal tooth marks on them. So they were using their teeth. The other thing that she found, what I think is really neat, was she by the burn patterns, she was able to show that Neanderthals were catching these tortoises and then turning them upside down and putting them on the fire and cooking them, which makes sense because they would crawl out of the fire, I suppose, for a little bit. And this is exactly the way they cook tortoises today in the Kalahari or whatever. I love the fact that they're cutting tortoises. In Spain, a little bit earlier, there's evidence that they're hunting rabbits. So they're not only hunting slow animals, they're hunting, that's actually a rabbit. It looks like a deer or something, but it's actually a rabbit. And there's evidence of cut marks on them, they have burn bones, etc. So they're hunting slow-moving animals, which you just sort of suspect because they're knuckle-dragging, slow-witted, dim-witted hominids, but they're also hunting fast animals.
How do you distinguish between animals that was found dead and cooked versus one that was captured?
You don't. But you can, if I understand, how do you distinguish between an animal that was found dead and cooked, scavenged, as opposed to an animal that was captured and cooked? You don't, except by the volume, I suppose, at a site. When you find lots of them, you wouldn't expect them all to have died. And humans, for the most part, there are a few groups that are scavengers. Humans, for the most part, eschew scavenged meat. Which doesn't mean that they did it in the Mousterian times with the Neanderthals, but so I don't have a good answer to your question. Sorry. I should have just said, I don't know. Except, I don't know. There's also a site where, in glacial Europe, most of the Neanderthal sites that were excavated, the really good ones, were done in the early 1900s. And they just hogged the stuff out and shoveled it out and didn't screen it and didn't save stuff. So it's only in more controlled excavations in the last 20 years where modern excavation techniques have been able to look for things like vegetable food. And in Europe during the Pleistocene and the colder parts, you wouldn't expect there to be a lot of vegetable food. But in the Levant, in the Near East, in Israel in this case, it wasn't that cold. And this is a site called Kabara Cave, where there's a famous Neanderthal that was found, a burial that was found. And they found a whole bunch of different plant species, including pistachios, that were ripening or available at different times of the year. So clear they must have been scheduling their environment. And in this case, I can tell you that the material didn't blow into the cave, because these are pretty good size. So at least during this, and this site's dated like at 57,000 years ago, at least, and there's no doubt that it's only Mousterian, it's only Neanderthals. So at this time, they're utilizing the plant material and they're scheduling their subsistence practice around the ripening season of the plants. There were some people that suggested, somebody published a paper a number of years ago on a tooth from Greece called Laconis, and they did strontium analysis on it and found that, a trace element analysis on it, and found that the Neanderthal had moved at least 20 kilometers away from where it was found. And I thought this was a total waste of paper to publish something like this. I mean, a slug probably, it can be found 20 kilometers away from where it was born, if it's picked up by a bird or something. I mean, to suggest it. But anyway, the reason that it's kind of a silly argument, but how it relates here is that Neanderthals were thought to have really small home ranges, and they didn't transport or trade items over long distances. And there are a couple of sites now, one in Germany, this is from a site in France, where Neanderthals are collecting raw materials, and you can tell this because of the signatures of the stone, the lithic remains, from as far away as northern France all the way down to almost the Mediterranean. So they have, as you can see from the quote, they have distribution patterns or circulation patterns of raw materials that's no different than us or than the Europeans that follow them. Even in terms of site utilization, it's thought that Neanderthals just go in and sort of fall down in the cave and wake up in the morning and then go out. But this is a site that was very carefully excavated by some people in the Near East, where they have, this is from a site in Syria, where there were clear activity areas that were associated with a hearth, where they had primary processing areas for making stone tools. That's the lithic area. In the left, there's a bedding area. There are rock platforms. There's a windbreak based on sediments that, based on elements that were found in the sediments and also structural details. So they clearly had a site organizational pattern that's like us. And when I say us, like the Europeans that follow them. We've already known this because there's a site, some of you know from, if you're anthropology, there's a site in France called La Ferrassée. There's a burial site, and I'll come back and talk about this more, but there's a very complex site of mounds that were found, of empty fossa that were found, and where it says LF1, 3, etc., those were all individual burials that didn't intersect with each other, and some people suggest that maybe there are some kind of headstones there so that they didn't come in and disturb the grave of an earlier person. And the question I ask is, could Neanderthals do all of these things without some kind of communication skills or symbolism or a language? And if we see these kinds of things, if archaeologists see these kinds of behaviors in the period that followed the Neanderthals, they say, aha, this is an example of their language or their symbolic abilities. But if you see them in Neanderthals, they say, well, you can't really prove anything. And the reason for that is that, part of the reason for that is that beginning in 1970, the first paper was published in 1971, an anatomist, Kralin on the right, and a linguist, Lieberman, on the left, did a vocal tract reconstruction of Neanderthals. And the Neanderthal is B, the one on the upper right-hand corner. And if you look at the larynx that is below or at the mandible or below it, it's in a different position in the infant and the Neanderthal than it is in C, which is like ours. And based on this, Lieberman and Kralin said Neanderthals couldn't produce the sounds ah, e, and oo. And since every human language has these sounds in them, that meant that Neanderthals couldn't produce a language. It's a huge jump because the specimen that's on the upper right is a Neanderthal, but when it was found, that was the La Chapelle. Remember that grizzled old Neanderthal that I showed you? It didn't have had hardly any teeth. The base of the cranium was broken. They used a cast that had all the teeth in place, and I mean, there are just all kinds of problems associated with the reconstruction. Subsequent work done by French in Paris, working on the original specimen again, La Chapelle, showed that the reconstruction was in error. In fact, the reconstruction they used was the old Beall reconstruction going back to 1913, as opposed to a modern reconstruction where they actually found pieces and reordered the base. So their conclusion was that they could produce all the sounds. Did anybody see, deviating from my talk just a second, but did anybody see it was on the internet about the guy at Florida Atlantic University that's been reconstructing Neanderthal sounds? He's now working on a whole Neanderthal sentence, but he did a Neanderthal vowel. He's a student of Lieberman's. Anybody have, and Bruce knows because I was telling him it a little while ago, anybody know what that vowel sounded like? If you can go on the internet, you can do Neanderthal vowels and you'll find it. It was this. Ah! That was the sound. I mean, as I told Bruce a little while ago, nighthawks make better vowels than that poor Neanderthal. But I think all this stuff has gone by the wayside, and there's more reason than just the faulty reconstruction. That reason is there's an amazing cave in northern Spain called El Cedrón. El Cedrón is a cold cave. It's being excavated by archaeologists wearing hazmat outfits, and they collect the bones and they send them immediately to the labs. They freeze them and send them to the labs so that they can do DNA. And just 2 years ago, or a year ago maybe, they did this and they found this gene in the Neanderthal, in the Neanderthal fossils from there. Its site's dated at 43,000 years ago, that has a gene called the FOXP2 gene. And this is a gene that's known to have two loci differences between chimpanzees and humans. The FOXP2 gene of the Neanderthal was exactly the same as modern humans. Exactly the same. Well, what it says for language is that people that have the mutation in this area was first found in a family in England that had this mutation that has like the chimpanzee pattern, and they can't speak. They're not able. It relates to the motor areas of language. They also cannot understand speech. Just recently, the FOXP2 gene was transferred into a mouse. To a bunch of mice, and did you see that one? And the mice speak. They don't speak. The mice. I'm tired, but don't be laughing at me. The mice grunted in a different way than they normally do. But the point is, it's called a language gene. I didn't call it that, but it's called that in the literature because people that have the chimpanzee pattern or have the mutation completely lack language. How does this relate back to fossils? Well, and now we get into some of the work that I've been doing almost. That is, there's a really interesting way that you can determine handedness, and it's by looking at teeth. And it relates to language, as we'll see. The initial work was done back in the late 1980s on the site in Spain, and just recently, in the last year or so, the last few months, 2 papers have come out, and they've shown that by looking at the scratches that appear on the labial face, on this face of incisors, upper and lower incisors, but particularly the upper incisors, you can tell by the patterning whether the individual is right-handed or not. And I'll show you more details about this in a second. And it's very convincing. At Atapuerca, they found, this is SEMs from their study, they found marks that were primarily, they're not quite horizontal, but the way they divided up the angles, these were horizontal. The 3 looks more vertical. You have some that are running in that direction, and then you have some that are called right oblique, okay? So that by looking at these scratch patterns, you can tell the primary actions of the scratches that were produced. And when they looked at all of the teeth, at all of the anterior teeth at the site, they found that in red, I modified their graph, just colored in the right oblique, made it all red. You can see that for every tooth, the highest number of scratches are the right oblique. Okay? How do we explain these? Well, this is based on some of the work that I've done in Croatia. If you pull with the left hand, if you're right-handed, you pull with the left hand and you process something with the right hand, and you're pulling. And when you pull, every now and then, if you don't cut your nose off or your lips off, you might nick your tooth. But it is shown by this woman that is pulling with the left hand, and as you can see, all while it's not hitting her mouth, every now and then you might hit that tooth. And when you do, you produce scratches that are primarily, a right-hander would produce scratches that are primarily in that direction. You see, and then there are some vertical ones. This one that runs right up that looks like a long perpendicular one is a crack in the tooth. So, but there, you can see there's some that are running the other direction, but most of them are running in that right-handed direction. Now, if you pull with the right hand and cut with the left hand, the marks are going to be, oblique marks are going to be going in the other direction. Okay, so here's a Neanderthal that's a left-hander, and you can see that when he's pulling, he can have the marks run in the opposite direction. And then again, there are some that are perpendicular or horizontal, but for the most part, this tooth we identified as a left-hander. Now, some of these teeth are not just isolated, but the teeth fit together, and we always find the same pattern. So if you have adjacent 2 central incisors, you never find one that's left and one that's right. They're mostly right. But if there is a left one, like shown here, the tooth that's next to it is also going to be left. So it's a really interesting way of an easy way. Well, it's a little more complicated than being easy, but it's a simpler way of determining handedness, and it's almost foolproof. And there's no other way to do it from the skeleton. We almost never have the left and the right sides. And even when you do, the differences aren't generally enough. They're almost within measurement area of the right humerus versus the left humerus to be able to determine someone's right-handed or left-handed. But you can pick up a tooth and you can tell whether it's a left-hander or a right-hander.
Are there any examples in modern humans where you see?
Yeah. Are there any examples in modern humans? And yeah, there are some studies of Aleuts and of Native Americans that have been done. They're not nearly as common, and there aren't very many at all in the people that follow the Neanderthals. So I think that it might be related to this particular culture, tool culture that Neanderthals are using. But they're clearly in Neanderthals, and they started at 500,000 years ago, and they go right up to 28,000 years ago when we have the last Neanderthals. But the key thing about it is that you can determine handedness. Yeah? Yeah, those are reconstructions. So I don't know what they're doing. And my guess is they're doing close processing, doing something here, like close processing. So they're pulling here and Neanderthals had edge-to-edge bite. They didn't have the overbite that we have. So the reason you can find them on the lower incisors is because they're hitting here, then they're continuing down. Okay?
Basically, they didn't have
Neanderthals show a lot of wear on the incisors. So they're clearly, we've known this for a long time, they're clearly using their mouth as a third hand to process stuff. And I'm not really sure if they're processing hides or if they're cutting tortoises apart or I don't know what they were doing. But the key thing is that you can tell whether an individual is left or right-handed on the basis of this. And the Spanish, I haven't done it, but the Spanish have done experimental work where they've had graduate students put mouth guards on, and they've given them stone tools, and they said, here, cut this meat. Well, you'd have to have them do mouth guards. And cut this meat, and you get the same patterns. Okay? So that's a really neat thing. And why is this related to language? Well, the reason we're, as a human species, primarily right-handed is language is that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And language is primarily on the left side of the brain. It's all over the brain, but there are major areas on the left side of the brain. And in comparison to chimpanzees that are about 50-50, or monkeys that are about 50-50, or there are some monkeys that prefer to be right-handed and others prefer to be left-handed. But as a species, we're the only species, of primates at least, that are, wherever they're found, whether they're found in the Pacific or whether they're found in South America or in Europe, it's about 90% right-handed. So it's related to brain lateralization. And brain lateralization, we've known, there's all kinds of evidence that shows that brain lateralization is related to language. So it's really neat to find these kinds of marks, because both of these are from a site called Vindia, dated at 28,000, 30,000 years ago. The one on the left, there aren't enough marks for us to tell if there was, it's a canine. But the two, the one in the middle on the right, you can see that you can see these marks. And I left at 4:30 my house this morning, and I forgot to bring, I had some casts I was going to bring you to show you. But you can see them with the naked eye, although our work is done with stereoscopic microscopes to put the marks in. Now, if we look at all of the Neanderthals that are found from the earliest, remember the Crepina ones are dated at 130,000 years ago, and the Vindia ones are dated at 30,000 years ago. So there's a 100,000 year gap. But you can see that they're primarily, and these were all European specimens, they're primarily right-handed. You can see there are two left-handers, one from Crepina and one from a site in France called Ortu, but all the rest of them are right-handed. And it's based on more than one tooth, because some of these individuals have 6 upper teeth and 6 upper teeth at least, that we can determine handedness on. So some people would say, well, not a very big sample, only 24. But you'd have to find a lot of left-handers in order to equalize it out to make it look like chimpanzees or baboons or whatever. Okay, so I think we can say pretty unequivocally that Neanderthals were right-handed. Now, if it came out that Neanderthals were 50-50, people would say, well, that clinches it. They were not lateralized, so consequently they couldn't have had a language, or were not language capable. But can you make the next step and say, well, they are lateralized because of the handedness? You have to be careful. But as you can see, they're overwhelmingly right-handed. So there's multiple lines of evidence that refute the idea that Neanderthals and their immediate ancestors lacked language skills. We have the FOXP2 gene. We have all this complicated cultural behavior that seems to couldn't have been done without it. And then we have the scratches on the teeth. The other thing, I didn't put it on, the other thing, it shows that Neanderthals weren't klutzes. Because if you're making these marks on your teeth, what's to keep you from cutting your lips off or cutting your nose off? I mean, if Neanderthals are just big dummies, they cut their whole nose off. So maybe they were. Maybe that's another possibility, but I don't think so. Let me finish up. I'm not quite done, but towards the end with this quote. This is Ian Tattersall, a friend of mine from the American Museum of Natural History. And he wrote this in 2006 or something. 8? Even worse. He said, Neanderthals left nothing behind to suggest that they possessed symbolic reasoning abilities or articulate language. I think we can eliminate the last one. because I think there is something left behind to suggest they had the capability, at least, of articulate language. We know that the reconstructions that were done by Lieberman and Kralin in the 70s were wrong, and we know that they have the FOXP2 gene, and we know that the brains were likely lateralized because we have all these teeth that show that they were right-handed. Is there other evidence? Well, there is this site that I mentioned before, Le Ferroçay. Let me just give you a little more detail about it. Le Ferroçay 6 is like a 5-year-old or something, and it's buried, you can't see it there, but it's buried underneath these points. There were 3 points that were laid over top of the grave. They weren't, and they were laid just like they're shown there. They weren't randomly thrown in. They're not put in the hands of the infant, but clearly they were associated with the grave. There's, excuse me. There's that's Le Ferroçay 5, sorry. There's Le Ferroçay 6, which is an adolescent. And you can't see it in the picture, and my pointer doesn't work, but the head was severed from the body so that the skeleton was buried down at the bottom of the pit, and the head was buried underneath the rock. That's shown there. And that's what the rock looked like. And those holes that are on the rock are not natural holes. They were holes that were indentations that were made. And they seem to be in couplets. It's not my analysis. Other people have pointed out they seem to be, you can see they're kind of in twos. And some people have argued that this was some kind of a grave marker. Who knows for sure, but I guarantee you if this was found at 32,000 years ago or 28,000 years ago, people would say, here's evidence of a complex burial. We also have not as many as we find later, but we find some manipulation of teeth into amulets, into necklaces, bones and teeth and clearly it's a Mousterian site and not an Upper Paleolithic site. So there's some evidence of art. And here's a recent publication of this is a small rock, not very big, but it's been pecked, and the white underneath is shown through, so it looks like it's not something that would have been natural. It looks like they were pecking on something, and it's not a tool, it's not utilitarian, so it seems to be aesthetic, but who knows for sure. Some really interesting stuff has come out by a man named Direco and a woman named Ceresi, looking at a site in France called Pestelazé, where they have all of these blocks of magnesium oxide that don't naturally occur on the site. They've been brought in. And this magnesium oxide is excuse me a second, I've been talking since. This magnesium oxide is a black pigment. Somebody might was talking about this to one of my students, and they thought, well, maybe they're taking because they had indigestion. But then we looked up, it's not magnesium oxide, it's magnesium dioxide, which apparently is not something you would take if you had indigestion. But it's used as a colorant. And there are some specimens that even look like pencils, being used as pencils. In Romania, there's a site, again a Mousterian site, where they have these cupules made out of stalagmite, made out of limestone, and there's red and yellow ochre in them. And it's, again, a Mousterian site. Now, there's no reason to have this stuff unless you're doing some kind of ceremony, your body painting your face or whatever. I mean, it's clearly related to some kind of symbolic behavior. But I'll say it's not common. But let me show you something that is also not common, but is pretty clearly indicates, I think, that Neanderthals were doing some kind of symbolic behavior, and they were doing it between 120 and 130,000 years ago at this site called Krapina in Croatia. The Krapina site is an old sand overhang that was excavated by this handsome guy named Dragutin Gorjanović Kramberger, who was a geographer, a cartographer, a hydrologist, and a paleontologist, but his paleontology was fish, and not human paleontology. But in 1899, he went to the site of, there's a town there called Crappian, and he went to the site and he found a tooth. And it changed his career because after that, he still did some cartography, but he published on this site. And the reason he published on it was because the site, all the material came from one area, it doesn't matter. The reason he published on it, and there's the date, the reason he published on it is because there is a lot of material from this site. And this is just part of it. There are more than 200 isolated teeth. I've already shown you some of them. There are incomplete crania, there are mandibles, there are more patellas, kneecaps, at this site, this one site in Croatia, than all of the rest of prehistoric Europe. There are 18 patellas. Why they're all there and why he collected them, we don't know. We have tooth germs at the site. There are scapulas. I mean, who knows for sure exactly how all this material ended up at the site. There are various people that have strong opinions about it. But there's no doubt that there's a large collection of bones. Well, I was most interested in, starting it about 5 years ago, in this specimen, which is the signature skull from the site called Crapina 3, or the sea skull. It's on the monograph, and et cetera. It was found in 1905, published in 1906. It was one of the latest specimens found at the site. And in 1995, almost 90 years later, in 1976, almost 70 years later, Walpoff put this piece of frontal on the rest of the facial fragment. And here's what the frontal looks like. It's what's called the frontal squamous, so it's above the supraorbitals. This is clearly a Neanderthal from the brow ridges. It's clear in the nasal shape, etc. And where the arrows are, you can see that it's not the whole sequence, but there are a series of lines that run up the frontal. One of the problems with the Crapina material is when Gorjanovich took it out of the ground, he covered it with lacquer. And the lacquer is really hard to remove. And this is the signature skull, and so the guy who's the curator, who's a really good friend of mine, doesn't want to remove the lacquer because he's afraid that the specimen might fall apart or something. He doesn't want to damage the specimen. So you can't do SEMs because of the lacquer that's on it. It just looks like kind of like a lake. But clearly there are marks there, but you can't see what the marks look like, what the details of the structure look like. You can't like you can on the teeth that weren't lacquered. So we had the opportunity to use a stereoscopic microscope and medical microscope. And if you can see that there are 35 lines that run from, they're all on this one piece that run from where it says 1 all the way across. We know that these marks are not recent. They're not due to cleaning. They're not due to trampling. They're been there for a long time because they're under the lacquer, for one thing. And second of all, they are under breccia that is from the site. So you know that they're old. They're not recent. And the arrow at the bottom just is pointing to a recent break that shows the white bone underneath compared to, you'll see in a second, compared to there's that recent break again, to the scratches that occur, the cut marks that occur on the frontal. Now these, again, it's an incomplete specimen, but they run right up the midline. They kind of cross over the midline, but they run right up the midline of the frontal. They're not on the brow ridges. There are no other cut marks of any, there might be one or two, but no other major cut marks or no other grouping of cut marks on the rest of the cranium. Here they are again. There's one intersection that's circled in white there. There are two crossovers where they crossed over, but all the rest of them are individual lines of varying lengths, but they're all about that long, basically, that run from the front on the left to the back on the right. And that red line is the midline, and you can see how they start. Who knows what's going on down in that black space down there, but they start above to the right side of the midline at the front, and then They kind of angle back across the back. Now, these marks are there, and then there are two large gaps. These marks differ from cannibalism. They're not associated with muscle mass. There's nothing there, just skin. There's fascia there, but there's nothing there. There's no major muscle there. They differ from defleshing marks that have been found. There's a woman that's sitting, a friend of mine that's sitting out in front here that did a lot of work on the defleshing of the site and suggested that a lot of that material, maybe all of it, is from secondary burials where the Neanderthals were exposed to the elements and then bones were collected up, and she did modern ethnographic analogs. It's a really interesting study. And I'd say that if she wasn't here, or she is. And they differ from all other marks of Crappina. So, I mean, are they symbolic? Well, they're not due to cannibalism. They're not due to trampling. They're not due to natural causes. They're not due to cannibalism. They're not due to defleshing. What's left? Tell me something that's left that they could be related to. My guess is that they're related to some kind of symbolism, some kind of ritual. By the way, they were done when the individual was dead. And we know that because there's no healing on any of the cut marks. So we don't know if it was done on a cranium that didn't have any flesh on it, or it was just on the bone directly. But clearly they didn't heal. So my guess is this is some kind of symbolic marking. And again, this is at 120 to 130,000 years ago, so it's way before modern humans could have come in and done that. Are there other places in Europe where we find these kinds of marks? There are no other skulls, and there are 5 or 6 other frontals, reasonably complete frontals from Crappina, and none of them show these marks on them, or any other kinds of marks, even associated with, to any extent, associated with defleshing. But there are a few other places where you find marks that are similar to it that are kind of spaced out, equidistant. And this is from a Mousterian site in Germany. They're not human bones. This is from a reindeer femur from France. It's unpublished, where the marks are kind of laid out. And so, you know, there is some, no one would argue that Neanderthals had the same symbolic capacities or left the same kind of symbolic evidence that we find in the Lascaux cave painters, but that's dated at 18,000 years ago, or, you know, there's some earlier stuff too, but nobody would argue that Neanderthals have left that kind of evidence. But to say that they're bereft of all kinds of cultural evidence is an oversimplification of the data. In short, many shared capabilities, behaviors, and morphologies between there are many. I didn't do that right, but I guess I got tired when I was writing that, like I am now. But anyway, you know the point. You know, I don't need to tell you. So Neanderthals were not the incompetent, knuckle-dragging fools commonly assumed. In fact, I was thinking, I'll probably get in trouble for this, but if you really want to insult someone, call them Ardipithecus. All right? Call them that. You'll hear about them. I wish I could be here next week to hear about that. That would be interesting. And I want to thank my collaborators. I want to thank the Sigma Xi people for inviting me, and I'm more than willing to answer some questions. Thank you.
In terms of the right and left brain, does that correlate with mammals? So, for example,
no.
Whales?
Oh, I don't know about whales.
Dolphins?
I don't know about them. But there are patterns of left and right in like gorillas and chimps, but it's not expressed in the kind of lateralization that we see in us.
I guess I missed the point about the fact, I mean, even if you believe that they couldn't do AI, would you assume that an organism would use whatever sounds that it could make?
The question is, even if you assume they couldn't produce the sounds ah, e, and oo, wouldn't you think that a species or an organism would use other kind of sounds to communicate? Their argument was, and I never checked this, but their argument, and Lieberman is a linguist, their argument is that all human languages have those sounds.
Right, but they
Neanderthals couldn't make that sound.
I know, but a human is going to use the sounds that it can make. Another organism that couldn't make that sound would just use a different sound.
Not according to them.
Doesn't make any sense, though.
Well, and besides, they could make those sounds. So, I mean, the argument's kind of, not your argument, their argument's kind of mute. Moot. Not mute, moot. Yeah, I agree. There's a tremendous amount of criticism about their reconstructions that they did. I mean,
No, I get that, but I just don't understand the logic. Even if you give them that, it doesn't make any sense.
I agree. You're on my side. Yeah.
You talked about
The
the Fox P2 gene.
FOXP2? Yeah.
Did people with defects in that gene, could they communicate like amongst themselves at all, or was it like completely lacking any capability?
The question is, the people that have the mutation in the FOXP2 gene, can they communicate among? I think they have. No, I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I don't think so.
There's been a television documentary on them, and there is some language. It's very restricted. It's in the family. It runs in the
Right, it's a British family, yeah. Yeah.
but
And they know
totally affected, but they have some language.
they have some, but
Clearly very impaired.
yeah. Yeah. Okay, we've known for a long time there are areas of the brain, if you have a stroke or something in the left side of the brain, you lose control of your right side. Okay, and we know that not all areas, but because the right side of the brain is also involved in language. But if you have a stroke in this area of the brain, in the temporal lobe, at the back of the frontal lobe, you lose the ability to speak, or you lose the ability to perform syntax, etc. And there are other areas that are involved in it. So we know that's on the left side. If you have a similar stroke on the right side, you may lose the ability to control your left arm, but you don't lose language. You might not be able to sing, but you can still speak. And we know that right-handedness, I mean, it's been known for a long time that lateralization affects handedness. So it's a little bit of, you have to cobble together language areas, lateral dominance, and handedness, but it's not that big of a jump. And it's not something that I came up with on my own. It's well, again, you can't really tell, but all you can say is that they show the same patterns that we see in speaking Homo sapiens. And maybe it doesn't mean they're speaking or not, but like I said when I was presenting that, if it was 50-50, or if they were primarily left-handed and very few right-handed, people would all say, well, that clinches it. They couldn't possibly speak because they don't have the pattern that we see in modern humans. And we have to use this uniformitarianism to using the present to judge the past, because we don't really have anything else to go on. Unless you're studying Ardipithecus, and you don't want to do that. You'll find out about that. Yeah? I couldn't hear the brains. Well, they show the brains also show something called pedalial asymmetry. So I mean, there are some morphological differences in Neanderthal brains that are similar to the brains that we see. You can just look at the endocranial casts, or you can do scans now. But the lobes of the brain are organized in ways like they are in modern humans. Again, you can't really be sure of this, but because the endocranium in humans, and presumably also Neanderthals, there's a lot of cerebral spinal fluid that blocks a good impression that the brain would make on the bone. Now, if it's a raccoon, the cerebral spinal fluid isn't so thick, and so you get really good impressions. But with humans, the impressions are not that good, so it's really hard to do paleoneurology in humans because of the lack of preservation of those areas. But you can look at the way the brain is structurally arranged in terms of the left frontal, right occipital, or whatever, however it works. And that's like, in Neanderthals, that's like us. So, I mean, you always try to do something, you know, and you try to explain it, and you try to do it in ways that is supported by data. And that's why we say that, I guess. Sorry.
Are Neanderthals more or less derived?
Are they more or less derived? Well, many of the traits that have been used to suggest to look for that are called derived features are shared with modern humans. In fact, Pabo, who's doing the DNA, the Neanderthal genome, from a specimen from India, the site that I've been working on suggests that modern humans and Neanderthals mated. He doesn't know what the implications of that, the genetic implications of that were, but I'm betting that there are a bunch of Neanderthal genes that are in modern sapiens. So at the genomic level, my guess is that they're not more derived. And again, many of the characteristics that have been used to look for whether they're derived or not are shared. So the morphological features. So it's a difficult question to answer. Neanderthal populations were clearly smaller. You know, throughout European prehistory, there were a bunch of selective sweeps that went through, and population crises that were associated with volcanoes erupting and with people coming in from, again, another wave coming in from Africa or the Near East, replacing the hunter-gatherer populations, et cetera. So there wasn't just the Neanderthals there, then the moderns came in, and that was it. There were all kinds of other population movements, so that Neanderthals were a small population, but so were the people that followed them. So it's hard to know. If you look at modern people in Europe, and look at the skulls of modern Europeans, say from the Neolithic, that were after that last sweep of people that came in, they have almost no Neanderthal features. They're basically like us, 1-2%. But if you go back a little bit earlier, they have them. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but it's the best I can do. Yeah? The human form of the gene was implanted in mice, and they changed their squeak. It lowered their squeak to. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The gene's a real common gene. I mean, parrots have it and stuff. The FOXP2 gene it's commonly found. Now there are allelic differences, obviously, in the other species, but the difference between I think it's Pablo that said, but anyway, somebody said, one geneticist said the differences between a guinea pig FOXP2 and a human are not that many loci.
So the fact that we find the human version of the FOXP2 gene in Neanderthal.
Well, first of all, it's really hard to extract DNA from fossils. And the oldest ones so far that they've found are Neanderthals, dated at 43,000 years, and they have the identical FOXP2 gene that we see in humans that's different than what we see in chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have those two loci differences. So it appears that Neanderthals had the identical FOXP2 gene that doesn't determine, but enables language in us, which is the reason.
I guess I'm not seeing, and this is probably a bit beyond the scope of the talk, but I'm not seeing how we know that gene is associated with language. It seems to be so disturbed across.
Because it's absence of it.
Well, there are a lot of animals that don't speak have aberrant forms of the FOXP2 gene. And the identical sequence that's found in modern humans that speak is found in the Neanderthals. Okay? And if you look at chimpanzees, I think that's the only, I don't know if they've looked at other primates, but they have differences at two loci and chimps don't speak. Now, presumably, if you put a FOXP2 gene in a chimpanzee, it still wouldn't speak because it doesn't have the vocal apparatus to do it. But probably, if you did that, it would do more than, if it's like the mouse model, it would be a little more complicated. And the other thing is that there were all kinds of other, and I can't remember what they were right now, but there were all kinds of other behaviors that were modified with the humanized FOXP2 in the mice, so that they were more roaming, or I forget exactly what they were. So it's not a one-to-one correlation between the FOXP2 and language. It has other effects. But what's interesting about it is it reverse it. If the FOXP2 would have been found to be like the chimpanzee in the Neanderthal and not like the human, people would say, aha, well, they couldn't speak because they had the chimpanzee FOXP2. But the fact that it's identical, in fact, Lieberman, in a paper in 2007 or 2008, said that Neanderthals would not have the FOXP2 gene, the modern version. And oops, and then the same year it came out that they had it, you know. And these guys are really surprised to find that. They were not expecting to find that. Just find it to be identical. So, yeah.
I just wanted to suggest a function for the scratches on the teeth. The illustration shows them working with the anterior rotation used as vice versa. High. But Neanderthals, and I'm way on their side, probably more radical than you are, they did not have forks and knives, so they weren't cutting up their meat on a plate. They were gripping the meat and then slicing off. It's called cut and stuff.
Stuff and cut.
Stuff and cut. Stuff and cut. And then you
Stuff
cut
and
it
cut.
off. And that's dangerous.
Yeah. I only put those pictures on to show you what a right-hander would do as a left-hander would do. It wasn't like that we associate them with processing hides. The other thing is that there's and I know you want to go, but the other thing is kind of neat that I don't know if it means anything or not, but females are more likely to be right-handed than males. So maybe a lot of those Neanderthals that we're looking at are females.
Cool.
You know? So.
Okay, well, I think if there are no more questions, I think we can bring this to a close. I thought this was excellent. Seminar. And also, you can email them with any